Welcome to Age of Noob everyone, and let's continue exploring economy upgrades in Age of Empires 4, namely for wood collection. Previously, we've looked into how often we should refresh our lumber camps, and this time we'll explore when we should get each technology that affects wood gather speeds to further optimize our economy. Let's dive right in. The technologies that we'll look into are Forestry, Double Broadax, Wheelbarrow, Lumber Preservation, and Crosscut Saw. Before we begin, here are two quick disclaimers. One, I've tried my best to place the initial lumber camp as equally as I could on wood lines that look as similar to one another as possible. Because there is no scenario editor for us to use, I could not ensure that all wood lines are exactly identical to one another, and the numbers in your games might be ever so slightly higher or lower based on the shape of your wood line as well as the starting lumber camp that you build. Practically speaking, this tiny difference shouldn't alter the conclusion we arrived to at all though, so you shouldn't worry about this. Second, I will refresh the lumber camp roughly around the second to third row of trees. I wanted the numbers to reflect real games where the refreshing of the lumber camps won't be as frequent and optimal as we've discovered in the previous video, but I also didn't want to leave it too inefficient to skew the numbers horribly. Alright, let's begin by looking at the raw numbers first, then we can analyze said numbers to find the optimal time to research them. Okay, here's the baseline for wood collection based on the number of villagers chopping wood relatively efficiently for a total of 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, 5 villagers can gather roughly 1600 wood with 1 lumber camp refresh, going all the way to around 6100 wood for 20 villagers chopping for 10 minutes. Now let's add Forestry and see how the numbers change. Forestry immediately shows us how ineffective it is when we chop in low numbers, contributing to only 40 extra wood with 5 villagers over 10 minutes. It does get better with numbers though, providing more than 400 extra wood for 20 villagers over 10 minutes. Hence, we can estimate that Forestry improves wood collection by roughly 3 to 7% depending on the number of villagers. That said, we'll circle back on how Forestry really works a bit later in the video, as we need to check the validity of these numbers against other technologies as well. When we add Double Broadax, we start seeing some proper improvement. Keep in mind that the numbers you see includes both Forestry and Double Broadax, as I've conducted the tests cumulatively to reflect real game scenarios. We collect roughly 175 more wood using 5 villagers and more than 700 additional wood with 20 villagers. This translates to a roughly 10% improvement in wood collection rate. Before getting lumber preservation, the next technology to pick up would be the Wheelbarrow first. With Forestry, Double Broadax, and Wheelbarrow researched, we collect roughly 150 more wood with 5 villagers and 580 wood with 20. Hence, Wheelbarrow's collection rate improvement hovers around a modest 7%. Of course, Wheelbarrow affects everything and not just wood collection, so keep that in mind. Moving on to the Castle Age and adding lumber preservation on top of the 3 technologies we've already researched, we collect an additional 160 wood with 5 villagers and roughly 650 wood with 20 villagers over the course of 10 minutes. Hence, we only see about an 8% improvement despite its higher cost, though this number could be slightly higher due to a slight margin of error. And finally, once we have our villagers fully upgraded with Crosscut Saw, we collect 200 more wood with 5 villagers and roughly 800 wood with 20 villagers. Keep in mind that I had to refresh the lumber camp twice for this technology as the walking time would be too long otherwise. This means that Crosscut Saw leads to an improvement of about 9% in wood collection. As mentioned before, if we assume some margin of error due to the different shapes of wood lines and villager behavior, it's safe to say that all typical wood upgrades contribute to an increase of slightly lower than 10% in wood collection. Okay, let's revisit Forestry for a second. If you remember, Forestry affected wood collection rates by roughly 3 to 7% based on the number of villagers you used. But what happens if you have all other upgrades and compare it with and without Forestry? Does it really make a difference in the late game? Turns out it doesn't. I set up an incredibly efficient wood line on Black Forest with 20 villagers, started said villagers with 2 lumber camps, and refreshed each side 3 times for maximum wood collection. Without Forestry but with all other upgrades, 20 villagers were able to gather 8,750 wood after 10 minutes of chopping. After Forestry was added to make the villagers fully upgraded, the villagers chopped 9,200 wood. Hence, that's roughly a 400 to 500 additional wood collected over the course of 10 minutes. While it is definitely worth it to pick up Forestry this late into the game as it is such a cheap and quick technology, the improvement is only about 5%. I initially thought that Forestry would have more impact as we scaled up and got into the late game to chop more trees quicker, but I was wrong. Realistically, you will only get roughly 3 to 5% improvement depending on the game and the map. Alright, those were all just numbers for us to see the raw impact of each technology. Now that we've established those baselines, we need to analyze when these technologies will be worth it to pick up to optimize our wood collection as much as possible without suffering a long payback time. Let's take a look. Let's begin with Forestry. Forestry only costs 75 wood and 45 seconds to research. However, you should notice that the additional wood collected after 10 whole minutes of chopping is abysmal. Once again, I will take the 2-minute payback time as the baseline, as I think it is reasonable and makes sense for most skill levels and maps. Hence, you will need a whopping 20 lumberjacks before you research Forestry to get your resources back within 2 minutes or 2 minutes and 45 seconds including research time. Once you get your resources back, you will get an additional 350 wood with 20 villagers chopping over the next 8 minutes. In summary, you should research Forestry when you have around 20 lumberjacks to get an additional 350 wood over the next 10 minutes while getting your investment back at the 2-minute mark. Let's move on to lumberjacks with both Forestry and double broadaxe researched. Of course, we can see much better numbers now, but the cumulative cost of both technologies are now 325 resources and 75 seconds to research, assuming you already probably have 2 lumber camps by that time. Let's crunch the numbers. Hitting the payback time at roughly 2.5 minutes means that you need at least a whopping 25 lumberjacks before we research double broadaxe. That said, you will get roughly an additional 1200 wood over the course of 10 minutes of chopping compared to not having any upgrades at all. Of course, you could technically get double broadaxe earlier at, say, 10 lumberjacks, but that would be unwise. It'll take about 8 minutes for it to pay back, and resources are much more valuable in the early game to spend on the right things, so researching double broadaxe before at least 25 lumberjacks often won't be optimal. Wheelbarrow follows the same logic, but this technology could be picked up before double broadaxe based on the build order you're following, as Wheelbarrow affects many other things as well. Regardless, if we assume you pick up Wheelbarrow at the same time you pick up double broadaxe at 25 lumberjacks, you'll get your resources back at roughly 2.5 minutes again, or 4 minutes with research time included, and get an additional 1750 wood after 10 minutes instead of 1200. Hence, Wheelbarrow would contribute to roughly an additional 550 wood over 10 minutes, or 55 wood per minute thereafter. This only looks at wood collection though, so my numbers above are only for lumberjacks. In reality, Wheelbarrow will pay itself much quicker, as you will probably have many farmers and miners by that time as well. Hence, you don't have to adhere to the 25 lumberjack rule here, and you can definitely be a bit more aggressive in its timing. I will make a standalone video about specifically Wheelbarrow though, so I'm not going to go deeper into Wheelbarrow for now. Lumber preservation makes things dicey. Forestry, double broadaxe, Wheelbarrow, and lumber preservation cumulatively cost 1,025 resources. Since the cost of lumber preservation alone makes up about half of that, we already know that we'll get some crappy numbers here. And fair enough, if you have a whopping 30 lumberjacks, you'll get your resources back in 5.5 minutes, plus lumber preservation 75 research time. That said, you will get 3,000 additional wood cumulatively over 10 minutes compared to having no upgrades. Hence, based on these numbers alone, I would really recommend not picking this up until the very late stages of the game, as the payback time is very long at about 6 minutes, and you only get an additional roughly 90 wood per minute. Moving on to the final Imperial Age upgrade, Crosscut Saw is an abomination of an economic technology, and it costs a whopping 1,000 resources to research. This means that, cumulatively, fully upgrading lumberjacks costs 2,025 resources, with half of it going to Crosscut Saw, despite only adding a bit under 10% improvement as we've seen earlier. Hence, at 30 lumberjacks, it takes a ridiculous 10 minutes and 15 seconds to pay back the investment. This is an awful deal. Unless you're playing a walled up, no rush, no cut, 50-minute boom slugfest on Black Forest or something like that, never ever pick up this technology. In most maps, settings, and skill levels, you're better off investing your resources elsewhere before finally getting to Crosscut Saw, unless you're already in the uber late game and population efficiency begins to matter. Hence, treat lumber preservation as your late game upgrade and Crosscut Saw as the technology you pick up when you're pop capped and have more resources than you can spend at that moment. Okay, we've gone through a lot of numbers, so let's quickly recap our findings and come up with a series of easy to remember rules of thumb that you can apply to most of your games. Number 1. Do not even think about researching any wood upgrades until you have at least 20 lumberjacks or more. The opportunity cost otherwise is simply too high, as the payback times become too long for it to be worth it. Regardless of what wood upgrade you get, don't click on anything until at least 20. Easy enough. Number 2. Even though Forestry is super cheap and might be really tempting to pick up in the early game, always adhere to rule number 1 and don't research it until you have 20 villagers on wood. It's just not worth it. Number 3. Forestry, double broadaxe, and Wheelbarrow are all easy to recommend to pick up in most games, with all of them paying back at roughly 3 minutes when you have around 25 lumberjacks. There might be very niche scenarios where you might get them earlier, but I highly recommend you do not research at least Forestry and double broadaxe before having 25 active lumberjacks, as Wheelbarrow has other use cases and might be picked up earlier just fine. Number 4. Only pick up lumber preservation if you have decently efficient 30 lumberjacks or more, and are ready to wait more than 6 minutes for it to pay back as you gear up towards the late game. Hence, treat this technology as if it's not a Castle Age upgrade, but a mid to late Imperial Age one, and only research it if you know that the game is going to last at least 10 to 15 minutes more for it to be worth the trouble. And finally, number 5, Crosscut Saw is extremely situational and should be almost always never researched. Unless you're in the uber late game, have at least 30 lumberjacks, know that the game is going to last at least 10 to 15 more minutes, are pop capped and need to delete villagers, and need to squeeze every ounce of efficiency out of your villagers, then do not get Crosscut Saw at all. You're better off spending those 1000 resources on a million different things before Crosscut Saw becomes even remotely worth it, as the payback time is over 10 minutes. Apart from maps like Black Forest, I really don't see this technology making sense on any other map that doesn't have an abundance of trees. Well, that's pretty much all you need to know about Lumbercamp upgrades in Age of Empires 4. As mentioned, your tests might have slightly higher or lower numbers due to a tiny margin of error, but none of the conclusions we've come to in this video should be affected at all. Make sure you adhere to those rules for most of your games, and refresh your lumber camps as described in the previous video linked below to fully optimize your wood collection. And if you've enjoyed this type of video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel to not miss out on any future Age of Empires content. As always, thanks for watching everyone, don't get your lumber camp upgrades too early, and see you all in the next one.